This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So I think we're going to start. Thanks everyone for coming. Very important meeting this. I am not Andrew Hussey. I'm standing in for Andrew. My name's Catherine Davies and I'm the Director of the Institute of Modern Languages Research here. And we're very closely involved in the Centre of Postcolonial Studies. And unfortunately I'm standing in for Andrew because he's very ill. He's in hospital in Paris. And he sends his best wishes, but I think he's really disappointed not to be here because it's meant a lot to him. So bear with us, you get better, I hope. I'm also standing in for the Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Philip Murphy, because Centre for Postcolonial Studies is in that institute at the moment. His wife has been taken very ill. And he too is in hospital with her. So I'm the last man standing, the last woman standing. But I'm really pleased to invite you because we have been involved in organising this event for some time. I should say also that the Institute of Latin American Studies here at the School of Advanced Study has also been involved. So this is a cross-institute School of Advanced Study initiative. Centre of Postcolonial Studies sits in the centre. It just happens to be housed in Commonwealth Studies for the moment, but it is working on behalf of all the institutes across SOAS. Sure. So just to give you a little bit of background, and I'm basically taking these facts off the website that Katherine Gilbert has so incredibly carefully put together, and I'll just give you an idea of what it was that Andrew has been trying to do, what his vision, as it were, for the Centre for Postcolonial Studies. So it was founded in 2014. It's new because Andrew Hussey was based in the University of London Institute in Paris. I don't know if you know about that. We have an institute in Paris, and he was the dean of it. So he was very involved in what was going on in Paris. His work is on French North African culture, and his major book, The French Intifada, came out in 2014. It's just been translated into French, and it's come out in paperback as well. So he then came to SOAS, and he said he'd like to set up this centre in order to coordinate post-colonial activities, post-colonial research, because it's being part of SOAS, the School of Advanced Studies mission. The reason that we're funded by the government is to promote research, to promote your research, and to facilitate your research, as well as to do our own research. So that whole idea of research promotion and facilitation, we're here to help you. That's the whole point of this centre and this school. So what Andrew's take on the Centre for Postcolonial Studies, do you want to just have a look?
Well, we just can't get it to read external hard drives.
Is the following. He wants Centre for Postcolonial Studies to facilitate dialogue between policymakers and academic researchers. That's his main intention, is to help the Centres of Postcolonial Studies in the UK work with and open up dialogue with policymakers. He's particularly interested in policy and consultancy arena in the UK, but also internationally. He wants policymakers to see the value of the research that we do, the value of policy relevant research in the humanities. He's also interested in reaching out to other disciplines. Very appropriate. Reaching out with other disciplines to engage with empirical research in the fields of law, medicine, governance, counter-terrorism, health studies and business. And he thinks that the centre here can be hybrid, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary organisation. Andrew has particular contacts with the British Council, and I see Martin's here from the British Council, so very helpful contact, because the first public manifestation of the centre was in the 2014 Hammamet conference in Tunisia, which was a major think tank organised by the British Council, and he works with journalists in Tunisia who had witnessed the first Arab Spring. That's where Andrew's coming from. He also has very interesting contacts with Chatham House, and in fact I think Martin knows with British Council, and Claire Spencer, is it, from Chatham House, are on the Centre Postcolonial Studies Advisory Board. So they're the kind of contacts Andrew has. He also has very good contacts in the media, obviously. We've had Matthew Rice today from the Times Higher. Is Matthew here now?
Yeah.
Okay, so Matthew's from the Times Higher Education Supplement over there. And also there are contacts with the New Statesman and the Observer, the Guardian in particular, Radio 4 and Channel 4, and the Royal College of Defence Studies. So these are contacts and real people, not just names of institutions, that we would like to work with you to get this dialogue going between what goes on in academia and what goes out, and what goes on in other sectors across society. So that's the director, Andrew, and that's the centre. And just a few words about Catherine's role here. So Katherine Gilbert, Dr. Katherine Gilbert, joined us about a year ago. She's the person who coordinates the activities here in the School of Advanced Study. Andrew is based in Paris. He's in Reed Hall. His office is in Reed Hall, which is Columbia University's offices in Paris, and also where the University of Kent has a site as well. So there are contacts there made possible with Columbia and with Kent. So Catherine's here, and she's been with us a year, and I hope she's going to stay a bit longer. Catherine's own background is in French and Francophone studies, as is Andrew's. And Katherine has did her PhD on Rwandan women genocide survivors in Rwanda, but she's working at the moment on African Chinese African connections, particularly cultural exchange and translation, and is getting very involved in looking at the influence of China in Africa. So obviously big contacts here possible with SOAS, who are next door. So that's where we're coming from. I just wanted to mention a new book that I saw advertised. I was at the MLA over the weekend. A new book's come out with Liverpool University Press called Bourdieu and Post-Colonial Studies, edited by Raphael Galeo. And the blurb for that is saying post-colonial studies since 2000 have turned away from the post-structuralist focus on language and identity to more sociological and materialist approaches. So I think that's been going on for some time, but that's where we're at. And then I'll just read the final paragraph of Andrew's blog, all of which is on the website. Of course, this is now Andrew's voice, Andrew's words, and Andrew's accent, I have to say. So, he says this: I believe in many ways that we have reached a turning point in post-colonial studies, and that in fact we got there some time ago. More to the point, for all the pioneering work that's been produced since post-colonial studies embedded itself in the academy, the world in the early 21st century has changed so quickly and so radically that as it was for Bataille, the old politics no longer makes any sense. The Centre for Post-Colonial Studies is a new and young initiative whose remit is not to turn away from what's been achieved thus far, but to build on these achievements. To do this, however, it's also my belief, and this is the biggest challenge, that we do have to step away from academia and the comfort zone of literary theory and into the deeper, more complex world of real issues, real problems, and sometimes real, raw violence. In fact, in the shadow of the terrible events of 2015, we have no other choice. And he wrote this just after the Paris bombings. So, on that note then, I will now turn over to Catherine, who's going to set up the first panel, and I suspect that the easiest thing is if everybody identifies himself on the panel.
Yeah, well, I'll just say a few words about the centre first of all, and then call up our first panel members.
All right, thank you.
Just pull up the website. Okay, so thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. I just need to point out a technical detail before we start. The event is being filmed. It will be filmed consistently throughout, and we do have a photographer taking some pictures. So obviously it's mainly focused on the speakers, but if any of the audience members are not happy with that, please do let us know. So I just wanted to say the initial idea behind today's event was initially to organise a small workshop bringing together heads of post-colonial studies research centres in the UK. But then once I started sending out invitations, we had a really overwhelming positive response. And as you'll see from how the programme has developed over the past weeks, we've got a wide range of speakers from across the UK and from Europe here with us today. We also have a number of journalists, I believe, hidden in the audience, as well as Matthew from the Times Higher Education. We have someone from The Conversation, from History Today, and from The Guardian. So welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. Now, I believe in terms of the UK-based research centres, we have most of them covered in the programme, but I have received apologies from a number of people. So first of all, obviously, Andrew Hussey, our own director, sadly can't be with us today. Graham Huggan, who is the director of the Institute for Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Leeds, sadly cannot be here, and I will be reading a short statement from him later on in the programme. Similarly, Alan Lester, who's the co-director of the Centre for Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies at Sussex, is unable to join us, and he sends his apologies. But to follow on from what Catherine Davies was saying about the mission of the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies here in London, I'd just like to say a few words about the activities that we're planning and part of our broader strategy over the coming years. In terms of short-term goals, we're setting up a research seminar series on the theme of post-colonial seas. There'll be one seminar per term, so as not to overload everyone on our mailing list with emails. Barbara Spadaro from the University of Bristol will be our first speaker, and she'll be focusing on the Mediterranean, and that will be at the end of February, early March. We're just finalising the date now. We also edit the journal Francosphère. We've got some flyers for that at the back of the room if anyone's interested. The journal is published with Liverpool University Press. We publish 2 issues per year. We currently have a special issue on Tunisia in press, and we're taking proposals for the next open edition. So again, if anyone is interested in following up on that, then do let us know. So just a few words before we start then about the broader vision for the CPS. So we'd really like the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies here to become a sort of hub for facilitating research in post-colonial studies. And I'm hoping that today's workshop will be an opportunity to take soundings from yourselves, the academic community, as to how our new centre here can best support and promote research in the broad area of post-colonial studies, and hopefully then to shape our agenda for the coming years. We've been developing a website, which you can see here, with some lovely black and white photographs from Melissa Thackway, our photographer. And on here you'll find all the information about the centre, about our events. We're also creating a list of affiliated members, so I hope that most of you here would like to be listed on our database, which I'm currently compiling, so I'll probably be bombarding you with emails about that as well after the event. We've also started a blog, which is here. At the moment we've just got the introductory post from the director, Andrew Hussey. But what I'd really like to do on the back of this workshop is actually set up a series of blog posts over the coming weeks, where all of our speakers hopefully can contribute something about their vision for the future of post-colonial studies. So I think that would be a nice way to engage in the dialogue on a sort of a digital platform. So yeah, we hope that then the website will become a tool for other researchers who want to find people who are working in their field, and also we'd like to use it to advertise events going on at other institutions. We certainly don't, if anyone has any doubts, we certainly don't want to set ourselves up as a monopoly. We'd really like to sort of facilitate and promote what's going on in other centres. And one final thing then, the main goal for this coming year and for this workshop is we'd really like to apply for a research networking grant based on, or following on from today's workshop, and then to run a large conference later in 2016. And I hope that this will be of interest to many of you in the room here, and that we can focus on this in the final half-hour discussion session at the end of the workshop. So it'd be great if we could all start thinking about sort of themes. It'd be good to identify a couple of key themes and to pin down some possible dates. So perhaps we can be thinking about that as we listen to our panellists. So I think then if we have 8 speakers in the first panel. So if I'd just like to invite them all up to join me here at the front. Okay, so Professor Sanjay Seth is our first speaker then, and he's a Professor of Politics at the University of London, and he's also the Director, at Goldsmiths, University of London, and he's also the Director of the Centre for Postcolonial Studies at Goldsmiths. So I'll pass over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that the centre has been opened in Senate House, and I'm glad to meet you all. One of the benefits of this event, one of the things we lack, it seems to me, is I think there's actually lots of people interested in postcolonial studies and postcolonial theory, but it's not self-evidently in the contemporary academic culture an area of impact, etc., etc. So funds are scarce and so on, and we're all aware of each other's existence, but the opportunities to actually meet and talk and collaborate are actually reasonably limited, and for that reason alone, events like this are valuable. But that's just a prefatory remark. A couple of words about the centre which I direct. It was established in 2005, which was a couple of years before I moved to Britain to take up the chair of politics at Goldsmiths. Somewhat unusually, since, as we all know, postcolonial theory has its origins in English or comparative literature departments, often originally in the form of Commonwealth Studies or Commonwealth Literature. It was located in the Department of Politics, although of course it's a college-wide centre encompassing comp lit, theatre, sociology, media and comps. Goldsmiths being the sort of place it is, there's actually a lot of people who, one way or another, are interested in or directly engaged in post-colonial theory, but they're scattered across different departments. And the idea was that since the interests of that amorphous body of literature that we call post-colonial theory had extended beyond its origins in literary studies to an engagement with epistemological, ethical and political questions, it was appropriate to give it a home which registered the expanding sphere of its set of concerns. And at a more mundane level, it helped, of course, that 2 of the editors of the Routledge journal, Postcolonial Studies, which I think was the first journal in the area, 2 of the editors were in the department, me being one of them, my colleague Michael Dutton being the other. And since then, Dr. Dave Martin, the managing editor of the journal, has joined Goldsmiths as well. The people involved in it have diverse interests. My very close friend and colleague Francisco Carvalho works on Latin America. David Martin is especially interested in visual cultures and the politics of visuality. And my own background is a mix of philosophy and theory and modern Indian history. I come out of the subaltern studies mill. My PhD supervisor a long time ago was Untitled Chapter, and I've sort of used India as an archive to raise a set of epistemological and political questions. So diverse people with diverse interests, and since about 2007, the centre's been quite active, although its activity sort of waxes and wanes according to the available time and energy levels of the relatively small number of people who are at the core of it, and subject to the constraints of shrinking budgets, minimal admin support, so on and so forth. A scenario that I assume is not unfamiliar to the rest of you. But we've organised a number of conferences and workshops, including ones in Japan and Brazil, funded by the Anglo-Daiwa Foundation and the British Academy, respectively. Various collaborations with a major art gallery in Madrid, Matadero, currently with our counterparts in Sweden, France and Italy. We've got a grant, sort of seed money to apply under that monstrous EU Horizon 2020 thing. So 30,000 euros to meet regularly and put together a grant proposal. Stuff like that. Speaker series, sometimes on theme, sometimes just catching someone interesting who's in Europe and we can afford to fly him or her over. Speakers have included Arnold Davidson, Harry Haratunian, Gary Young, Walter Mignolo, Lila Gandhi, my friend Lila Gandhi, who was also an editor of Postcolonial Studies, with Melotre and others. Most recently, a film festival that showed 20 films drawn from various parts of the world. It was called Films from the Underside. And we hope that that'll become an annual event. Now, we face the problems that many of you face, as I mentioned, scarce resources, pressures on time, etc., etc. But since I moved to England, and I'm a foreigner here, I've been here 8.5 years now, one thing that struck me quite forcefully, which is that the interest in post-colonial studies in Europe has been increasing rapidly, might be an exaggeration, but from a low base, there is a lot more interest in places like Germany, Spain, and elsewhere than there was when I first came in. One index of that is just being invited to give talks in European countries. There is a growing interest connected with a whole range of phenomena. I was recently in Germany 2 or 3 times, and one of the things that struck me was that the older professoriate are almost overwhelmingly completely uninterested. In fact, I suspect they regard it as a form of charlatanism, post-colonial or whatever. But the younger scholars are very interested, and their students, the PhD students, are extraordinarily interested. I mean, you organise something there and they turn up in droves. So it seems to me that we're in a funny position where there's actually a lot of interest driven by diverse considerations. Second generation, the children of migrants who are now going to university, the refugee question, changing patterns in world politics, etc., etc. But there's actually a growing interest and therefore also growing possibilities for interesting conversations, organising interesting events and so on and so forth. But to make use of this, there needs to be some coordination because, as I mentioned, I'm struck by the fact that I recognise a lot of the names on this list. We've published some of the people on this list in post-colonial studies, and yet I've met very few people here. So one of the things we need, and one of the many reasons to welcome this establishment of a Centre for Post-Colonial Studies in Senate House, is that there needs to be, ideally, a kind of fulcrum or a focal point, which, amongst other things, can coordinate and bring together the growing number of people who do have an interest in this sort of theoretical endeavour, but who don't always have sufficient opportunity to meet, to collaborate, and to forge partnerships and joint projects.
Thank you very much.
I'll vacate this chair in case someone wants to use
Have a little bit of musical chairs here. So our next speaker then is Professor Kendrick Oliver, who is Professor of American History at the University of Southampton and also Director of their Centre for Imperial and Postcolonial Studies.
We'll get some free advertising. And thank you for inviting me. I'm a little bit of an interloper here, possibly as a result of being an American historian, possibly also not being somebody who counts themselves necessarily as a specialist in postcolonial studies, but I'll talk a little bit about my position in the few minutes that I have. Firstly, I should say that the Centre for Imperial and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Southampton may be somewhat unusual in this company in that it owes its existence, its presence, to the existence in the university's special collections of the papers of the first Duke of Wellington, the Wellesley family, Lord Palmerston, and Lord Mountbatten of Burma. And that fact has tended to shape the centre and its activities, I think, in a number of ways. Firstly, it's a centre of imperial as well as post-colonial studies, although we do have a number of scholars associated with the centre who are post-colonial specialists, who are scholars of decolonisation and so forth. The centre is probably not quite as subversive of the metropolitan gaze as some of the original mission statements of post-colonial studies perhaps suggest the field should be. Or at least the work of the centre, alongside that of others, has explored the diversity of metropolitan perspectives, the anxieties that attended them, as well as the sort of strategies of the subaltern. So quite a lot of the research going on in the centre continues to explore the kind of myriad mechanisms by which empires, formal and informal, have and continue to be maintained. So these include human networks, technology and trade, food diplomacy, my own interests, kind of religion, religious missions, other forms of culture as well. Secondly, the link with the archives indicates the significance of historical practice to the work of the centre. The centre is genuinely interdisciplinary. A number of staff associated with the centre are located in the English department and have an interest in post-colonial literature. That's reflected in a number of our events, including a workshop on probing the post-colonial that we held a year or so ago. But at the risk of projecting the kind of theoretical conservatism of historians onto my colleagues in the English department, my sense is that kind of across the disciplines, the scholars in the centre at Southampton tend to be more interested in thinking historically about the relations between the colonial and the post-colonial, in particular places at particular times, and about the uses of post-colonial theory to illuminate those relations. We're generally not following on through the harder deconstructive implications of post-colonial theory, or alternatively on attempts to elaborate it as a body of theory with a kind of universal transhuman application. So it's probably fair to say that the work that goes on in the centre is working with post-colonial theory rather than sort of on it or in it. And so it's become, I think, part of the repertoire of approaches that we can adopt as we seek to make sense of our subjects alongside other relatively recent additions to that repertoire: memory, transnational, spatial term, and so on. Thirdly, the presence of the archives at the University of Southampton, which is the result of not uncomplicated close connections between the Wellesley family and the University of Southampton, and of the proximity of Broadlands estate, which is where Lord Palmerston, Lord Mountbatten lived. Those have probably shaped the interest of the scholars associated with the centre in the significance of place, spatial relationships, human networks, and mobilities. It's also the case that Southampton was a significant port of empire, as well as a point of transit and entry in this kind of ongoing global churn of post-war, post-colonial population movements. So much of the work at the centre on empire, decolonisation, post-colonial is shaped by this orientation towards maritime spaces, connections, maritime connections, and also to Southampton's role in the creation of an Atlantic world. So we have two forthcoming events hosted by the centre that reflect that orientation: an evening of songs and discussion on Alexander Hamilton's Atlantic World, which is stimulated by the success of Hamilton the musical in Broadway, and also an AHRC-funded workshop entitled An Empire of Islands, which will explore the role of islands as key nodal spaces of empire and as resistance to empire. And this fits in, I think, with the theme that you're obviously developing here. So that's what the centre does. I'm not quite sure whether our ecumenical and pragmatic approach to post-colonial studies reflects a kind of broader arc of post-colonial studies more generally, from sort of transformation to institutionalization, from resistance to co-option. Perhaps that happens to all interpretive models eventually. Or it may be the case that my perspective on this is actually sort of is a provincialism born out of privilege, association with a university that has its own dubious connections to empire. The fact that I'm thinking in that way is an indication of the continuing influence of post-colonial studies, I suspect, anyway. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So our next speaker then is Professor Ziad Elmarsafy, who is Professor of Comparative Literature at King's College London, and he's going to be talking about the post-colonial interest at King's.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, when Catherine invited me to present here, I started dutifully doing my homework and collating information about, the kind of research that's happening at King's. I should explain why I had to do this. I just landed at King's 3 months ago, so I haven't met everybody, and I'm still, trying to figure out who knows what. And then I very quickly saw the error of my ways, because there's just too much going on, far more than can fit, on a slide or a presentation, or even a handout, on matters post-colonial and post-imperial at King's. This work is happening across the arts and humanities departments at King's. So that would include comparative literature, English, all the modern languages departments, classics, music, and most interestingly, theology. But also a lot of the departments that are classified as being in the social sciences. So by this I mean the Institute for Middle Eastern Studies, a lot of the global research centers that King's set up recently, and so on. Now, this diffuse arrangement exists not because King's doesn't really care about post-colonial studies, far from it. But rather it reflects, I think, the current state of higher education in the UK. Under the current, in my view, extremely neoliberal dispensation, and I'm sure this is not limited to King's, as Sanjay Seth pointed out, we're all urged to think of ourselves as one man or one woman businesses, dynamically connecting with each other and collaborating or more frequently competing with each other to generate vast amounts of research funding. Now, be that as it may, I would hope that one of the things that comes out of today, again, to echo what Sanjay Seth said, is more conversation, more collaboration, just getting to meet and talk to each other and actually do things that we want to do together, instead of simply putting ourselves at the service of whatever the higher-ups think we should be doing. So, having issued that disclaimer, I will say that King's enjoys considerable strengths in projects dealing with the Middle East and North Africa and the Mediterranean. I'm thinking here first and foremost of people in my department, my colleague Anna Bernard, but also people in French like Nick Harrison, Siobhan McIlvany, people in history like Philadelphia Amy, in Spanish, I'm thinking in this project on global languages. Martin Stokes in music has written some beautiful things about Turkey, and Roddy Beaton, who's written a very interesting book about Greece and the decolonization of Greece. We also enjoy strengths in South Asia. Javed Majid, who brings a very solid theological training to his work in post-colonial studies, Ruben Irana Sinha, and most especially, and most relevantly for this week, Shantanu Das, whose grant on World War I is culminating in a major conference at the end of this week on Thursday and Friday. So if you're around, be on the lookout for that. To carry on this list, we also have people working on Sub-Saharan Africa, like Zoe Marge, about whom Catherine knows quite a bit because they both work on Rwanda. South America, I'm thinking here of Catherine Boyle, David Treese, Elisa Veratudla, among others. There's also a lot of work that cuts across and connects various regions and departments. So for instance, Anna Bernard has a new project on solidarity that I think is very promising and can generate a lot of interesting conversations in this respect. And then finally we have people who transcend all these categories and inform them all. I'm thinking here in particular of Paul Gilroy. So it's really a very interesting place, but everything is happening everywhere. So post-colonial studies doesn't really have a center at King's, it is everywhere and nowhere at King's. And this has advantages and disadvantages. In terms of teaching, my department, the comparative literature department at King's, revolves around and does a lot with the idea of world literature writ large. And so by this I mean world literature from Goethe and Weltliteratur all the way to through post-colonial and imperial questions to recent reflections on the topic, informed most significantly by people like Franco Moretti, David Desblache, and so on. Needless to say, there's no consensus among us on what counts as world literature, and we like it that way. My individual position, and I've gone on record saying this, is that it makes more sense and it would be more fruitful to talk about the worldliness of literature rather than world literature as a category to think with. But this is a debate that won't end. We'll be resolving this soon. I will add that we are opposed to the bland flavor that the idea of world literature has taken on in a lot of other places, not least in the US, where I used to work, whereby it seems to have become, and this may be a slight exaggeration, but I don't think it is, it just seems to have become post-colonial literature without the guilt. And I think this is completely unacceptable. It's just, you've got to always and everywhere bring in the post-colonial and the imperial as something to think with. In the time I have left, I'd like to make a plea for some areas that could usefully be added to our research agenda. None of what follows is meant to dismiss or diminish the very interesting and important work that has already been done in a lot of these areas by people in this very room in some cases. But rather that I think we have a lot more work to do. And as the news makes desperately and urgently clear with every passing hour, it is something that we, as committed intellectuals, really have to do because nobody else will if we don't do it. Not that the news should always drive research, but it's there, things are happening, we have to deal with it. So I'd like to propose 3 axes of inquiry, and they are religion, the state, and an expanded chronology. Religion. A lot of work that's done on religion, and that continues to be done on religion, and not just Islam, by the way, which tends to be which has recently been one of the most important categories in this respect, still operates in a register firmly rooted in sociology and informed by the multicultural Britain perspective. This has yielded some great results, and I'm thinking here of the work that Amina's done, the work that Anshu, is he in the room? Yes, he is. Yeah, there he is. That man has done great work on religion. But this doesn't necessarily mean this discarding Marxist or Weberian readings of religion. It does mean relaxing some assumptions that still operate about belief in a lot of academic work. So this is not limited to postcolonial studies. Religion may well be the opiate of the masses, but that doesn't mean that every believer is high or stupid. The skeptical and secular position is still normative, despite the work deconstruction was doing in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I recognize as I say this that deconstruction and postcolonial theory have not always had the happiest and most productive of relationships, but I think there's more we can do here. I'd like to see more serious engagements with the link between capital and religion, Weber again, but perhaps done more intensely and brought up to date. I'd like to see us take more seriously the reality that we might be seeing the end of some religions in some places, such as Christianity in Syria and Iraq. Indeed, Christianity anywhere in the Middle East apart from Egypt and Lebanon. I'd like to see more work, I'd like to see the work that has been done on global Christianity, to take one example, exercise a greater incidence on the way that we think about religion as a postcolonial and as a contemporary issue. I'd like to see greater thought devoted to the ethnicization and racialization of religion, the way in which we use the language of race to talk about minority religious communities, again, usually, but not exclusively, Muslims. To sum up, we need something like a postcolonial phenomenology of religion, something that actually takes stock of the vast amounts of work that have been done on the subject, though not necessarily under the postcolonial banner, might be in order. The second category, the state. Again, perhaps because of the Marxist beginnings of literary theory and later postcolonial theory, not to mention the, in my view, correct critique of nationalism, there's been a tendency to overlook the state as a unit of analysis. Against all predictions, and despite the ravages of late capitalism, rumors of the death of the state are much exaggerated. The fact of the matter is the state has not simply withered away. We are not done with it, and it is not done with us. The default position seems to be that the state is there to oppress and exploit, which is true, sadly true in a lot of cases, but it does not explain the persistence of the state and the insistence with which people, postcolonial or not, adhere to it. New thinking about belonging will help us to reinvent, reconfigure the state. Finally, I'd like to call for an expanded chronology, and this is probably the least original of all my suggestions, but it bears repeating. There's been a very interesting debate going on in history, actually, about the return of the longue durée as an analytical framework. And I think we in postcolonial studies would do well to take heed. One of the standard and most facile critiques of the work being done in postcolonial studies is its relative ahistoricism. One recent interesting example of this is the exchange between Jean-François Bayard and Robert Young, when Bayard critiqued the sort of the rediscovery of postcolonialism in France in the wake of the 2005 riots. But one easy antidote to this endlessly repeated polemic is simply to expand the terms of historical reference of postcolonial studies. This makes sense not only because of the imperial formations that we work with have actually tended to model themselves on previous empires, usually Rome, but not exclusively Rome, but also because it'll serve as a salutary reminder of the ubiquity of imperialist thinking around the world and of the persistent dialectic of nation and empire, power and justice. A lot of this work, again, is already underway. At SOAS, for example, I'm thinking of Francesco Orsini's work on early modern India, or Elizabeth Tyler's Center for Medieval Literatures at York. And I think those of us who work in the modern and contemporary periods would do well to connect with that framework. The advantage of doing this would be that we could formulate a new and better understanding of the worldliness of empire and empire building. We would be facing head-on their brutal continuity in human history rather than seeing them as an exceptional feature of the last 2 centuries, despite the undeniable scale of the latter. So to conclude, to name my desire, I'd like to see more close readings of religion and more distant readings of history, with the reading of the state somewhere in between, close and distant, to the extent that that's possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll pass over now directly to Dr. Matthew Brown, who is a leader in Latin American Studies at the University of Bristol, and he was the director of their Centre for the Study of Colonial and Post-Colonial Societies from 2008 to 2014. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to talk briefly. Like all the other institutions and centres, we organise things a lot. So the painfully named Bristol Centre for the Study of Colonial and Post-Colonial Societies, currently directed by my colleague in English Literature, Dr. Madhu Krishnan. She's unfortunately not able to be with you today because she's in California. Our centre, founded in 2005, very strongly shaped by historians such as Robert Vickers, interestingly and complicatedly linked to the ill-fated Empire and Commonwealth Museum, about which the less said, better. Our centre now has 3 geographical areas of focus, I suppose: Southeast Asia, Latin America, and increasingly Africa. But I think as an overview, one of the ways in which post-colonial studies is most embedded in Bristol is that it's taking the lead in engagement and impact activities. So in fact, most of the colleagues involved in the centre are doing the most interesting and original work, engaging with Bristol itself and its histories of slavery and racism and the geographical spread of the city. So I thought I would just briefly name check a few of those projects for you so that you are aware of them, and just end by giving you an example of one of those projects in the last of my 5 minutes. So the first is this project here, the Transnationalizing Modern Languages project, which is a big AHRC grant run by my colleague Charles Baudet, who's an Italianist, and with whom works Barbara Spadaro, who's come to give your first talk, which is, I think, a good example of the way in which post-colonial studies has been dragged, kicking and screaming out of the its history focus at Bristol, and is doing something different, transforming pre-existing disciplines. So it had a very ambitious remit of changing the way in which modern languages is conceived and thought of and exercised, executed across the UK. It's a wonderful project. We also have several other ongoing projects around the histories and contemporary nature of slavery in Bristol and worldwide, run by my colleague Josie Gill in English, doing a literary archaeology of slavery and slave trade in Bristol, and my colleague in Lusophone Studies, José Lingna Nafafe, who's working on a similar project across the Lusophone Atlantic through 5 centuries. So I wanted to end by just showing you this, which is a project that I've spent the last 2 years doing, which is called the Kipu Project, which is an attempt to do something useful with post-colonial studies, if you like. So to move away from what might be seen as the navel-gazing theorising of the last 2 decades and actually change the world a bit. So this project was the result of 2 AHRC grants through the REACT Hub, which was encouraging collaborations between the creative economy and academics, of whom I was one. My colleague in political science, Karen Tucker, was the other. And we produced this interactive documentary, a post-colonial oral history project, with a multimedia film company called Chaka Studio, based in London, and several women's organisations in Andean Peru. And it tells the stories of the nearly 3,000 men and women who were sterilised in Peru during the 1990s, often without their consent. And the way in which we have tried to do this is to create an online archive that delivers people's testimonies directly to the ears of internet-connected people around the world. So most of the people who speak through the Kipu project have no access to the internet and therefore are not able to share their testimonies via Twitter or Facebook. We created a phone line which automatically delivered the testimonies from a landline to a platform which put it onto the internet. So much as I'd like to share it with you, I know that the laptop isn't connected to any speakers, so therefore there's not much point in sharing an oral history project without sound. So instead I would urge you at your earliest possible convenience to put Kipu project into your web browser, spend 10 minutes or so navigating through this beautiful electronic Kipu. The Kipu, as I'm sure you know, is the Inca way of sharing histories and stories through knots and chords rather than through written writing. So we've produced an electronic Kipu, and each knot there is a story of the sterilisation campaign in the 1990s. So that's been our lessons through doing about post-colonial studies in the 2 years since I ceased being director of our centre.
Thank you. It's certainly fascinating watching the movement of the Kipu on the screen. Okay, so I'll pass over now then to Anna Ball, who is Senior Lecturer in English and Co-Director of the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies at Nottingham Trent University.
Thanks very much. And I'm afraid I was chatting to people at the start, so I didn't have time to get our website up, which I very hastily do now. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me here today. I'm a senior lecturer in English at Nottingham Trent University, though I specialise in world literatures, particularly emerging post-colonial contexts such as Palestine and Afghanistan. I'm actually currently on maternity leave from that job at the moment, so I have a 3-month-old lurking suspiciously somewhere outside this room. So if you hear sudden shrieks and I make a dash for the door, that's the explanation for what would otherwise look quite a strange situation. So, our Post-Colonial Studies Centre was founded in 2000 by Ella Kaboma, who is now at Oxford, and other founder members, Nen Yousaf and Patrick Williams, who are still members of staff at Nottingham Trent University. It's now one of the largest research centres at Nottingham Trent, and indeed Post-Colonial Studies is a recognised strength of the humanities at Nottingham Trent. We have 6 post-colonialists in our English department, unusually. Myself, Jenny Ramone, Nicole Tiara, Humaira Saeed, Naim Yousaf and Phil Leonard. Several other members in media, international relations, sociology, modern languages. We have a number of associate members drawn from around the world, a visiting research fellow from the University of Innsbruck at the moment, and increasingly we have many student members. We have thriving undergraduate programmes in post-colonial studies, and we seek to introduce our students to the post-colonial research culture through a programme which we have at NTU called the SPUR Scholarships, which allow undergraduates to participate in fully fledged academic research projects, and many of our SPUR scholars have now gone on to become PhD students in post-colonial studies associated with our centre. We're quite a young research centre in the sense that many of us are actually at the start of our careers rather than necessarily having lots of very prominent names. But one of the things that is very distinctive about us, I think, is that we are strongly committed to the category of the post-colonial rather than moving towards ideas of the global or of world literatures. But we're also very resistant to ideas of any kind of post-colonial canon, and so we're interested in new contexts and applications of the term post-colonial, how it functions today within the world. And this has led us to focus our efforts on a major research project at the moment, which we're developing over the course of 5 years in the run-up really towards the next REF, which seeks to explore the relationship between post-colonialism, activism, cultural consciousness, and new forms and spaces of resistance. Now, this project really comes out of our sense that activism has been an emerging social force over the past few years. We've seen it in the emergence of the so-called Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, various forms of campus activism, and we're really interested in how the idea of the post-colonial chimes with those forms of activism and resistance. And so there are many forms of many different projects through which we're exploring these questions, in part through the individual projects of members of the Post-Colonial Centre, which includes my work on Palestine and the Middle East as emerging post-colonial contexts, Jenny Ramon's work on readers and reading as modes of consciousness raising in post-colonial discourse, Nicole Tiara's work on Dalit literature and translation as spaces of resistance that also challenge class-based strata, and Humaira Saeed's work on post-colonial sexualities and how that might chime with forms of LGBT activism. But beyond those individual projects, we're also working on this 5-year programme to explore the theme in a broader sense. And what we're doing at the moment is running a series of fortnightly seminars at the centre, which is seeking to identify from across the disciplines figures who we think might constitute a kind of emerging academic discourse in this idea of post-colonial activism. And these include people such as Cornelia Grubner. I'll just quickly show you some of these events, who works on Mexico, Corinne Fowler, who else do we have here? Dr. Kahindi Andrews, thinking about blackness, radicalism and activism. And we are seeking to expand this into a much longer term programme through which we're going to continue to collaborate with some of our local arts organisations and cultural organisations such as the New Art Exchange, which is a multicultural arts organisation in Nottingham, in order to bring this into the public realm with what we hope will culminate in a festival of post-colonial activism, which will seek to draw together creative practitioners, scholars and activists in order to explore how the post-colonial functions in the world. So just a brief final kind of plea for collaboration and interest in the centre. We are interested in academic collaboration and networking. These of course remain incredibly important, but we're also interested in forms of collaboration and networking beyond this. We're interested in networking with those involved in activist communities and in political movements within post-colonial contexts. We're interested in working with community organisations, interested in promoting different forms of post-colonial and cultural consciousness, in networking with departments and centres beyond the humanities, particularly international relations. And we're also very interested in hearing from academics, creative practitioners, including artists, writers, filmmakers, local community groups, publishers, or anyone who would be interested in running an event at our Festival of Cultural Activism, around which we're currently constructing quite a substantial bid to one of our research councils. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in working on that project with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll pass over now to Amina Yaqin, who is a senior lecturer in Urdu and Post-Colonial Studies at SOAS, and she's here today representing the Centre for Cultural, Literary and Post-Colonial Studies.
Thank you, Catherine, for very kindly organising all of this in collaboration with your colleagues here. It's a great honour to be here, and although I feel slightly that I'm not quite the representative you were looking for, because I don't chair the Centre for Culture, Literary and Post-Colonial Studies at SOAS, but I've been asked by the director, Professor Francesca Orsini, to step in. I currently chair the Centre for the Study of Pakistan, so I slightly get confused sometimes because that's extremely post-colonial as well. But one of the things I'll say about post-colonial studies at SOAS is that it's a shared value across all the disciplines that we teach, and the centre itself is located in the Languages and Cultures faculty, but it's also very much present as a shared value in the Law and Social Sciences faculty, as it is in the Arts and Humanities, and I've had the pleasure of working with colleagues all across those disciplines and had various conversations, and I think all of us at SOAS are reminded of the post-colonial as we walk into the building and we look at the SOAS crest that is still there outside, which says knowledge is power. And it's a very kind of historically contextual reminder of where we come out of and where we are and where do we look towards where we're going into the future. Now there are lots of things that are happening in the Centre for Cultural, Literary and Post-Colonial Studies at SOAS, and I would welcome you to look at the website and to kind of acquaint yourself with it. But I've decided, I did have a PowerPoint, I'm just going to try and bring it back up. I thought it would be easiest for me to just speak from a position of where I'm currently located in the field, rather than try and represent colleagues' projects that I'm not fully acquainted with, but I know are hugely valuable. So I wanted to talk to you about the contexts of post-colonialism and interculturalism that come out of two projects, which I'll talk about in a minute. And this is a shared conversation with my colleague, Professor Peter Morey at the University of East London, who is also a post-colonialist. And if post-colonialism is to maintain its commitment to social justice, and I'm picking up on some themes that Ziad touched on earlier as well, and some of the others, and if we're keen to, for our commitment to social justice and to addressing the most pressing contemporary issues that we face in society today, one of its priorities must be the position of the Muslim diaspora in the West. The fraught history of Muslim, non-Muslim relations since 9/11 is too well known to need repeating. And indeed, today, again, courtesy of David Cameron and some highly disputable figures on English language proficiency amongst Muslim women, we have been reminded of the perennial popularity of the mission by white men to save brown women from brown men. So this is the issue of mostly Pakistani and Bangladeshi diasporic women not knowing enough English to save their children from becoming radicalized, I think, is the subtext of the conversation. Now, my contribution at SOAS to post-colonial studies has been to be involved in two key projects. One was the AHRC funded Framing Muslims project, which was an international research network, and it brought together colleagues in Europe and the US and the UK, which ran from 2007 to 2010. And indeed, it's included colleagues like Anshuman, who's at the back there as well, and others. And following on from that project, we then got the RC UK, Research Council's UK funded Muslims Trust and Cultural Dialogue project, which ran from 2012 to 2015. And in these two projects, we've been tasking ourselves with understanding the broad cultural and political context of anti-Muslim prejudice, as well as exploring the means by which stronger intercultural understanding may be built. And it's this twin task of critiquing neo-imperial Islamophobia in attitudes and in policy, while also looking at intercultural trust building, which I would argue is one of the key tasks facing post-colonialism today. We need to explore how mutual dependency, not only in Western multicultural societies, but globally, is a feature of our modern world, with the proliferation of migration, refugees, the upheaval in the Middle East and North Africa, post-Iraq, Arab Spring, the role of ISIS, and the continued advance of capitalist globalization. We need to confront the paradox whereby the ever faster movement of capital is deemed desirable, but its resultant movements of people undesirable. As Judith Butler reminds us, the interconnected vulnerability that we share necessitates the recognition of the quote-unquote grievability of the other, geographically remote subject who may suffer at the hands of Western policies. And indeed, this is hugely to do with state formations. Continuing Muslim grievances at the injustices in Palestine, Kashmir, and other flashpoints, and the way these are downplayed by the press and politicians represent a fundamental unwillingness to embrace this interconnectivity. So there is an international level on which we need to force a confrontation with the intercultural realities of our world. However, as we've been finding on the MTCD project, there are particular challenges presented in the multicultural societies of the West that are presently insufficiently attended to. In our work, we have looked at the political and philosophical level, whereby the tenets of political liberalism, which stand behind the evolution of the nation state, come into tension with alternative models of social organization based on religious or transnational principles. What is the prospect for reconciling these viewpoints in current and future statecraft? What compromises need to be enacted, and by whom? In itself, of course, this is not a new debate, as the work of the theorists of multiculturalism from Tariq Mahdood to Pikku Parek shows. However, if the discursive disavowal of multiculturalism as a political project is now canonical and assimilationist rhetoric dominant, how can we clear space for the idea that cultural accommodation must be mutual if society is to evolve in a healthy way? In addition to these large-scale questions, we have undertaken case studies of art groups at a local level to explore the means by which trust is created in potentially tense contexts. So, for example, we have looked at the Muslim Jewish theatre group Muju and the interfaith Baraka Choir. A full analysis of potentially transferable trust-building techniques will be part of the outcomes for this RCUK funded project. However, suffice to say at this point that a degree of cooperative mutual vulnerability was at the heart of the successful overcoming of potentially crippling differences. Now, one other thing I want to say coming out of the discipline of literary studies, studies within postcolonialism has a part to play in this too. Literature is not only a subjective, personal, artistic statement, of course, but a context-driven, imaginative projection. It operates in a world where relationships of trust have to be negotiated. Indeed, you could say that literary fiction, for example, itself acts as a series of mini experiments in the creation of trusting relationships between characters and context. Where these are cross-cultural, they operate within the same framing parameters as other kinds of public utterance. As such, it provides an important and underexplored resource in trust building. What can we understand through poetry, fiction, or drama of the imagined life worlds of different groups with their utopian and dystopian projections? The lack of attention to these issues, and also, it opens up that conversation of history. The lack of attention to these issues in policy circles, among other spaces, bespeaks what we think is a functionalist model, which is about short-term crisis management, rather than a serious attempt to forge ahead with the inclusive imagining of a better social environment. Now, postcolonialism has, of course, been concerned with all these matters, albeit in a more general or nation-centered sense. There have also been criticisms from some quarters that postcolonialism's roots in secular critique makes it incapable of encapsulating a religious mindset. However, the popularity of recent novels by, for example, the Sudanese writer Leila Abu Leila gestures towards a flexible capacity for embracing non-secular viewpoints, even if the critical and reviewing industries continue to see such texts as essentially anthropological curiosities. National partnerships to expand and extend this work would be welcome. At the same time, there is work to be done internationally in building an alliance of context-specific research that will help to build a composite picture of Muslim-non-Muslim relations in Europe today. One of our MTCD outputs is a feature-length documentary called Journey into Europe, produced in collaboration with Professor Akbar Ahmed of American University at Washington, D.C. We've also worked very closely with colleagues at Michigan State University on the Global Halal and another documentary. So such work future work would be necessarily multidisciplinary, informed by the best scholarship in other fields such as sociology, history, and political science, and characterized by the best traditions of postcolonial questioning. There is a prevailing discourse tending towards the scapegoating of Muslims. Recent terrorist incidents and the punitive anti-libertarian reactions to them in countries such as France, Germany, Belgium, and elsewhere dovetail with broader interventionist agendas in the world at large. In view of this, it is no wonder that intercultural trust is at such a low ebb. Postcolonial studies, we believe, is uniquely placed to make an important, informed intervention to correct misconceptions and build a more just civil society for the future.
Okay, so I'll introduce Professor Bill Marshall now. He's Professor of Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Stirling, and he's here today representing the Centre of Post-Colonial Studies at the University of Stirling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's my turn to thank you for organising the event and for the invitation. I'm just going to talk about what we're working on at Stirling, myself and various colleagues, the kind of emphases we have, and how they might feed into the agendas we're trying to set today. If you'll forgive this slightly naked self-publicity, I'm going to speak to various, if I get this to work, book covers. Accepted. There we go, right. The first of our emphases is to do with cinema. Postcolonial studies at Stirling largely takes place within modern languages, in our case it's simply French and Spanish, in English studies, and also to a certain extent in religion, which I'll come to briefly in a moment. And just to take up some of the points raised earlier, my colleagues in religion are well versed and to be interested in various aspects of theory, including post-colonialism, and have branded themselves as working on critical religion, looking at religion from not a theological viewpoint, but from anthropological, literary, philosophical, and so on. Very unfortunately, they have come under assault recently from the institution, and at the moment there are only 2 of them left, but we shall see how things develop. But first of all, cinemas, we're rather uniquely placed at Stirling in that we have, within French studies, we have specialists from every, specialists on every film producing area in the Francophone world. So my colleague David Murphy, for example, is an eminent specialist in African cinema, both North African and Sub-Saharan. I work on Metropolitan French cinema, but also Quebec cinema. My colleague Elizabeth Ezra works on French cinema, but she, in a lot of her work, she brings post-colonial analyses and approaches to looking at canonical French film output, such as The New Wave. My colleague Christina Johnston, her book on French minority cinema looks at the cinema of the banlieue in France and the attendant issues. Now, these various specialisms have certain kind of methodological consequences as well, which I'll talk about in a sec, but this slide is about the African Film Festival based in Edinburgh that we work closely with, Africa in Motion, which was founded by one of our PhD students 10 years ago and has gone on to great success. So now, one consequence of this plurality of film studies approaches is something which feeds into a wider set of problematizations, if you like, of the French studies and Francophone studies discipline itself. So my colleague David Murphy, often working with Charles Forsdyke, who is present, has been very active in promoting the subdiscipline, if you like, of Francophone post-colonial studies, to bring these issues into the centre of the discipline of French studies, but at the same time to challenge the occasional monolingualism of post-colonial studies as a discipline in general. So one of the things we're interested in, obviously, is bringing questions of language centrally into post-colonial studies. But another consequence is this bedeviling appellation of French and Francophone, French and Francophone studies and so on, which many departments or divisions in academia are now called. Because the problem being, of course, is that appellation perpetuates a hierarchy, a centre and periphery, where Francophone is the other to French, and where you end up in the rather bizarre position of saying that France is therefore not Francophone in that sense. So a great deal of our work turns on trying to challenge this, trying to find new solutions, new vocabularies and so on. And my project on the French Atlantic was precisely to try and undo these binaries and to see the Atlantic as a shared space of exchange, of domination and so on and so forth, but by a series of particular histories, cultural histories, and transactions. So this question of language feeds into another project which we're hoping to develop and which I think would suit well the context we're in today, which is the question of cities in translation. Now, quite obviously, all cities are cities in translation in the sense that there are linguistic minorities and so on. What this particular project is interested in is looking at examples of cities in which historically and or in the contemporary period one language is not dominant, in other words, where there's been a competition between at least two languages in terms of what is the hegemonic language in that urban space. And some of these agendas arise particularly, or began in fact, in Montreal. A colleague in Montreal, Sherry Simon, has written this book, Translating Montreal, Episodes in the Life of a Divided City, and she has another book, Cities in Translation, which looks at other examples such as Barcelona, Nicosia, Colonial Calcutta, and so on, based on this original paradigm from Montreal. So the English-French division in Montreal, which, like many other examples of cities in translation, is a product of the ebb and flow of imperial history and colonial history, is also interesting to track in very kind of specific and concrete ways. That is to actually look at what were the circuits of translation which established or developed relations, particularly in Sherry's approach, literary relations between language groups. So, for example, one thing that emerges interestingly in translating Montreal is the role of Jewish intellectuals as intermediaries between the two languages. So we think this is a very kind of potentially very fruitful approach, and we can perhaps you've all got now the names of cities popping up in your head as to what examples might be taken. I was talking to Susan Parnell earlier, of course, about the case of Cape Town, which would be very interesting to take. So there's a new volume coming out called Speaking Memory: How Translation Shapes City Life, which is another anthology of essays on cities, to which I've contributed, where I return to examples from the French Atlantic project, that is New Orleans and Montevideo, to talk about how these approaches around translation could be developed there. So yes, the politics of language in post-colonial studies I would flag up. And finally on this topic, the subject of translating Christianities, which is a project being developed by a colleague in Hispanic studies and a colleague in religion, which is looking at the transactions which occur in that contact zone between Spanish colonists and missionaries in the Andes in the early modern period, and the reaction of and the relations with Quechua-speaking indigenous peoples and so on. Another track we're following, and particularly my colleague Fiona Barclay, whose two books I put up here, are the question of settler colonialism, particularly within the Francophone world, but beyond. The orthodoxy being that France did not produce settler colonies in the same way as Anglophone and other empires did, with the exception, supposedly, of Algeria and the Pied Noir. So Fiona is developing a comparative project looking at this issue of settler colonialism, and interestingly, she's been working with colleagues in Canada, where, of course, the French Canadians are in a certain amount of denial about being a settler population, because a lot of in the historiography of the French Canadians in Quebecois, the idea is that they were a conquered people, conquered by the British and so on. But just very briefly, to mention projects which began on the English side. This was an AHRC project which ended last year on devolving diasporas. The creative writing section of English studies as well is very active within this. The Out of Bounds, this anthology of British Black Nation poets, came out of the Devolving Diasporas project. One of our creative writing lecturers, Megan Delahunt, this is an example of her novel, The Red Book, which is set in Tibet. And finally, to talk about a space which I think would lend itself very well to a multilingual comparative approach, is to look at the Guianas, this anomalous space in South America, which contains, obviously in French Guiana, on which I've worked, the only remaining European, the non-sovereign territory, the only remaining non-sovereign territory in the Americas, and the comparison with Guyana and Suriname by a colleague, Gemma Robertson, who has worked on Guyanese nationalism. So that was just a quick tour through what we're doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. It's interesting actually, because we do have the three Guianas conferences coming up in London in October, and then so that would be fantastic to terminology there. And interesting as well that you started talking a lot about translation, because we're now going to hear from Professor Lucile Desblache, who is a Professor of Translation and Transcultural Studies at the University of Roehampton, and she is the Director of their Centre for Research in Translation and Transcultural Studies, so another sort of take on the post-colonial. Thank you.
Thank you. Once upon a time, at Roehampton, there was a centre in post-colonial and transcultural studies. But I think that the general management took Spivak's title and saying that comparative literature was dead rather seriously. And in view of the pressure for impact-related subject, because we are primarily driven from the teaching point of view from translation, the centre that I now direct is a centre of translation and transcultural studies. Nevertheless, as my colleagues here have pointed out, translation is very often issued out of post-colonial themes and consequences. And also, we have a very good legacy in post-colonial research. So what I'd like to do is to show the areas in which we work and which hopefully we can converge. I'm very interested in today because it's a very good way of not feeling isolated. So I could find 5 main areas in which we are involved. The first one is the French Sub-Saharan Africa. A theoretical aspect of post-coloniality, but particularly relating to Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and also the idea of survival narratives, which is also in link with another area I'll mention later, animals and post-coloniality. And obviously post-coloniality in translation, and particularly in one area, which is music. So I'll mention the idea of music. We are particularly interested in music theoretically, because rather than considering transfers from the periphery to the center, as is usually done in translation, music allows trans-peripheral movements, and it also allows movements from the periphery to the center, yes. So we're particularly interested in that. So the second area is animal studies, and I am particularly interested in that area. So we have several colleagues who work on the French-speaking world and on the Sub-Saharan Africa, but also mainly on the French Caribbean, and on Patrick Chamoiseau, Édouard Glissant, Daniel Maxima, but also on South Africa. And we do have some link with the Center for English and Creative Writing, who work on English Caribbean writing. So it is primarily about representation of the non-human in post-colonial literature and post-colonial cultures, and looking at them in a comparative way across the West and the post-colonial world. The third area is genetic criticism, particularly with African writers, and we have in particular Patrick Corcoran, who works on Amadou Kourouma with the CNRS, and looking at African writers and genetic criticism, how they have evolved, how much publishing in the West has implied transforming their writing, to what degree, what has been the process, the editorial process, in the transformation of their writing. This is just a manuscript from Soleil des Indépendances. The fourth area is what I have called post-colonial realities and fiction. One interesting project that we are working on at the moment is a study on masks, and particularly masks on cinema. And one of our colleagues, Karine Chevalier, has a project with Westminster University on this, and also works in collaboration with another of our colleagues who works on the banlieue and minority and ethnicity, Bruno Labasseur, and how much post-coloniality masks and hiding identity is relevant to contemporary realities. But also on fictions, because we do have some colleagues who publish on post-colonial author. For example, here are a few names: Nabil Fares, Daniel Maxima, and Salman Rushdie in particular. We've also have some colleagues who work in comparative literature on J.M. Coetzee. And finally, we have a discourse of race and cultures and post-colonial behaviors in South America, particularly in Cuba and Mexico, where we have a project at the moment studying the development of Zapatistas and how they're transforming post-coloniality really through new models. So, as you can see, these 5 areas are a little bit disjointed, but we do manage to work together. We have a regular series of seminars, mainly across 3 centers. One is the Hispanic Research Center, one is the center that I direct, and the other one is the Center for Research in English and Language and Linguistics. And I particularly at the moment have developed quite strong links on the music and post-coloniality and translation aspect, because we have a colleague who works on the sociology of rap, which is quite useful to build from. So I very much hope that if you work in these areas and if you have some project ideas, or that you contact me and that we can meet and develop these further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we won't take any. We'll save the questions for the final discussion session at the end. We're going to take a quick 10-minute comfort break now, and then come back in here for the second session, which will focus. So here we've heard from different centres in the UK, and we'll then be hearing from people who represent different networks which are pan-UK, and also from some international European research centres. So thank you very much again to all our speakers on this panel. Thank you.